Okay guys, so in this video I'm going to walk you through temporary messages, and one common issue that you will face when you're on the web trying to virtually verify if a user has seen a temporary message. So let's get into it. First and foremost, let's talk about what we're going to cover. We're going to cover temporary messages, three common issues that you will find when you're actually using different approaches to figuring out if a user has seen a temporary message, and a concept that is new in the browser. It's up and coming. It's called intersection observers and how they can help us basically. So let's get down to business. Now, first and foremost, I want just to touch on the notes, which is going to be that intersection observers, we're going to cover them last. They are fairly supported right now. It's really, if we have a look at, no, let's do that. So intersection observers are fairly supported right now, so if you're just looking for stable technology, then this video is not for you. I will just tell you right now that I am as disappointed as you are that this is not fully supported, and I really urge Safari to get this thing going, because I think that there is a lot of power in this technology. This is probably one of the most important things I have seen in recent time when it comes to being able to do what I call lazy loading. And lazy loading is just one aspect you can do with this. I'm going to show you another use case that is focusing on something slightly different, but hopefully you will get why I find this technology so powerful. But let's start by talking about temporary messages. So a temporary message could be anything that is something that you want to show to the user once and then either never show again or show in a different state. So we can have an example, something like a notification. Let's say that you have push notifications or something like an event flow for your user, where you want to show a list of the messages or the events that has taken place in the system since the last login. And the next time the user logs in, you want to show those as already viewed. That's what we're going to cover. Let's just walk through the files first and foremost. So we have a server. It's just an Express server that is requiring our application. And if we go to the application, it's a dirt simple little Express server that has a body parser, and it includes something called messages. I'll talk about that in just a moment. We have something called messages here as well. I'll talk about that in just a moment. So we use Express Static to serve up our static files. We have the body parser so that we can parse JSON. We have a root that leads to an index.html. /click leads to click, and scroll and observer. And then we have a get endpoint for messages that's going to return a JSON structure, which are these messages. And then we have a post, which is going to be to slash messages, and we expect there to be a viewed messages array on the body. And then we loop through, or rather we loop through the messages that we have, which is, I'm going to show you them in just a moment. It's just an array of objects basically. So we loop through all of the messages on the server. We check for the messages that have come in from the client, and we simply check if there is a message that is not rather if the updated messages that we are virtually what we're trying to do is that we're trying to tell the server that, hey, the messages that are coming in this property here, yeah, the user has seen those. Can you just flip them so that they have some way of remembering that, hey, they've already been seen, so we don't have to deal with them the next time the user comes and looks at things. And we do that by simply mapping over all of these messages that already exist and creating a new message with an ID and the message itself, and this true will make sense in just a moment. And then finally we return the JSON structure, basically the array that we have now mutated. So if we have a look at the message object, it's just a simple function that takes in an ID, a message, and is viewed, which defaults to false, and that's the entire object. So this is the flag that we're switching, as you could see over here. We're setting that to true so that we can remember that, hey, this message has already been viewed. And then we have this messages script, which is just going to create 100 messages with a default message. That's all it does. Alright, cool. So let's have a look at the first script. So if I now refresh this page, we can see that there's a gold styling here I'll just actually show you the CSS for that. It's some basic styling, and what we really want to do here is that we want to, the color is going to be gold if the message has the class name unviewed, otherwise it's simply going to be white. So let's look at the let's look at the first strategy for all of this. So here we have the script for the index.html page as we saw earlier. So it's just loading in this elements script and this messages script, and the element script is just a very simple helper function that I made so that I can very easily create a list item element, and we don't have to go through that really. It's just something, a higher order function takes in a name, some attributes, and returns a function with attributes and children. We create the element, we get the keys from the attributes, we set all the attributes on the created element, and we set the inner HTML to whatever children is. And you could make this much fancier, but for my little demo here, we're just going to work with basically text, so we don't really have to think so much about that. So here we have our messages, which is the only script that's going to be loaded on this page. So the first thing we do is that we get the only thing that's on the page, which is this unordered list. We grab that, we use await to get the data from the messages endpoint we saw earlier. So we parse all that to JSON, and now this JSON property or this JSON variable has all of the data. We loop through it all, and then we simply check if the isViewed variable is set to true, then hey, we're just going to set message li. Otherwise, we're going to set it as unviewed, and then we're simply going to append to this unordered list here. We will simply append the list element with all this data onto it. So the result that we get is this view here. Now let's talk about the semantics. So this first approach that we are going to look at is, all right, we assume that if a user has seen the page, the user has seen the messages, because this is a very simple example, but this could, on a mobile device, this could have easily been a notification flow. So let's just say, just for the sake of argument, these are all my notifications, and now our assumption is that hey, the user has seen all of it, and I can scroll up and down here, and yeah, I have all my notifications. And the code that we have to achieve this is that we simply make a fetch call, a post, and we set application JSON and content type to application JSON, and then we simply send all of the messages. We grab all the IDs from the messages that we have stored here, and we send that to the server and say, hey, can you update all of these messages? And that's it. So if I now refresh this, I'm going to get back a list of white elements, because now we have decided that the user has seen all of this. So there's no reason for us anymore to show the gold color for any of this stuff. Right. So this is a very common approach to solving this problem. However, the issue with this is, as you can see on a mobile device, this might, or even on a desktop when there's this many messages, the issue is that when I first looked at this page, I started scrolling downwards to just show you guys how many elements there were, but there was no real reason for me to do so. What if I had just stopped here? What if there were new messages further down the page? With our current approach, we wouldn't actually behave as if the user has already seen that, but we don't know if the user has seen these messages. So that's a little bit of a problem if we simply assume that if the page has loaded, the user has seen the messages, because it's simply not true. So let's see if we can fix that. Let's do node server, and let's go to our second example here, which is, it's basically the same HTML with a slightly different script that's going to behave in a slightly different way. We'll walk through that as well. No, let's not do that. Let's do this. Click, click. Here we are. So, next page. This time, if I refresh, we see that there is no update to our state. The behavior on this page is that we say that, alright, we can't just assume that the user has seen a message if we load the page. So let's see if we can approach this by clicking. So if I now click on the first element like that, and I refresh the page, hey, it's white. And the same thing goes for whatever I click on. So the assumption here is that if a user interacts with an element, then we assume that the user has seen it. We're being smart now, right? So let's just walk through that code really quickly. So I have split this up into two different scripts. So first and foremost, we have the same boilerplate as earlier. We get the messages, we loop through all the JSON, and we basically append the children. So we dynamically create that list of elements. And then what we do is, oh yeah, sorry, there's one main difference here. We see that we've added a bunch of attributes in this scenario where we add one specific thing here, or rather two actually. So we have an onClick attribute, which is going to reference API.viewed and with this keyword, and then we have data-js with the message ID of that thing, which is going to make sense in just a moment. And this is what's creating our list and bootstrapping an onClick event listener that is referencing this object up here that we are instantiating right before we're actually running that bootstrapping code, or the thing that basically creates the list, right? So what it is, it's just an object that is returned with a single function that is called viewed, which is going to take in an element. And when it's being called like this, with this keyword as an attribute on that element, this keyword is actually going to be referencing the element itself. So it's going to be the list item. So we're getting the list item. We are grabbing the data-js attribute there so that we can actually get the ID string. We parse that to a int so we can know what ID that element actually has. And then we do the same thing as we saw earlier. We're simply sending an array with a single ID. Now you might be asking, why are you always sending an ID and not just a single ID as opposed to what we're doing here with an array of a single ID? Well, it's a great question. The reason why I prefer using an array as a way to communicate to the server that, hey, these are the messages that have been seen, is because it's very flexible. If you say that you're going to send a single message for every ID on the page, you're locked into making a lot of network requests. But if you always send an array, you can actually decide how many, the logic can change. You can have compound messages. Maybe clicking on one of these notifications should actually send several IDs. And there's actually no downside to simply sending an array, because if you want to just send a single array, a single element, you can just add a single ID to that array. And if you want to send several IDs, you can send several. So in my opinion, this is a little bit more flexible. Onwards. Anywho, this is the approach that we have now. So what's the issue with this? Well, the issue here is that now we can actually not know if the user has seen all of this, because we have forced the user to click on every single element. They have to interact with every single message, and that's a very bad user experience, right? You don't want to do that. I mean, it's not that great, right? So what we really want is to have a way of knowing, okay, has the user actually seen the message? To be sure that that has happened, we have to find out if the element that is going to be this information, this text that we're showing, has it been in the viewport? And so we're going to go to the next attempt of doing this. Let's do scroll. And let's restart that server so where we get a fresh state. Yes. Okay, cool. So let's scroll a little bit here. We're scrolling, and we're scrolling up again. And let's refresh. And here we see that we have a bunch of white stuff. The text has gone white, and if we go even further down, we can see that, oh, there's a bunch of stuff down here that hasn't been viewed yet. And if you refresh again, we see that that is now actually also white. And there's, it kind of behaves the way that you would expect, right? If it's scrolling into the viewport, it is being updated correctly. Now, let's look at the code for this. And just trust me, the HTML is basically the exact same thing. So here's something that is slightly different. So what we're going to do here is that we are going to grab the JSON and do the same bootstrapping we saw earlier. We're simply creating all the elements, and then we have a handle scroll function. I'll touch on that in just a moment. After the bootstrapping or grabbing all the data, and that's all on the page, we are going to grab all of the list items on the page, and then we're going to add an event listener or a scroll event listener to the document itself. And we are going to have a handle scroll function. Now, what the handle scroll function is going to do is that it's going to take in all the elements, it's going to map over all the elements, and it's simply going to get us the ID which is something we put on the element we saw here earlier in the bootstrapping. It's just a data, we create a custom attribute called data-jas-id to store the ID on the element. And then we added this property as well, which is just isViewed, so that when the server is sending us data, we can actually know if this has already been seen or not. Anywho, then we have this isViewed property on the object that we're mapping over, and just put it simply, if we have set that attribute to true, then we declare this to be a true Boolean. And then we have this property, which is the key thing here. So we get the bounding client rect, and this is a function that simply returns location information about the element itself. And then we simply check if the y property is less than the window's inner height, because if it is, we know that this is actually in view. Because if, let's say that the inner height, let's say that the viewport that you're looking at is 500 pixel high and this element's y position is 600, then you know that this is actually outside of the viewport. So that's the way you can actually figure this out. And then finally we filter, and we simply we check if the element is not viewed and the object is in view. Well, then we're going to grab all the IDs of that element, and that's going to return us this ID array. And this ID array is simply going to be all of the elements that are not viewed and they are in the viewport. And if that number is greater than 0, we make a AJAX call, a post, and we update everything, right? So that's the behavior you're seeing right here. So if I scroll all the way down and I refresh, hey, everything is white. How awesome is that? What's the issue with this? Well, the issue with this approach is that it is immensely unperformant. Every single time you scroll on the page. Now you can of course optimize this. I'm not saying that this is like perfect production level code. You can tweak this, and this is actually not that uncommon. I would even say that this is the norm. This is the way I would solve it today, very similar in this manner, with a little bit of more bells and whistles to optimize this a bit. But this is the backbone idea of how to do this in a browser today. As I said, the issue is that get bounding client rect will trigger a repaint or a re-render of the page. It's actually a very heavy operation for the browser to do. And it's the same thing with actually accessing the inner height, because the browser now actually has to figure out how big the viewport is. These things are not ideal, and on scroll is probably the least performant damn event listener there is in the browser. You could do debouncing here, and you could say that, hey, just if they're scrolling, run this function only if they scroll, every X amount of time steps or something like that. There's tons of stuff that you could do to optimize this even further. This is just a very basic example, but I want you to know that luckily for us all this complexity that you're seeing in this unperformant behavior is now being solved through something that is called intersection observers. So let's look at the final version of this. Let's look at the observer, and let's restart that server. So here we are. We have an observer, and first and foremost, I start scrolling a little bit here, and I refresh, and everything behaves exactly the same way as we saw earlier. It is doing the exact same thing. Now, let's look at the script here and just walk through it. So first and foremost, we grab all the data, we occupy all of the elements basically, we append these list items, and that's it. And then finally, or I'll touch on this function here in just a moment, but let's actually look at the full bootstrapped code beforehand. So we have a bunch of options that mean some weird thing, and this is the thing that is interesting. So we have this intersection observer object that we instantiate with the function we saw earlier and the options, and that gives us an observer. We grab all of the list elements, we loop through them, and we simply hand them to the observe function. What's happening here is that this is now registering this element to the observer, and the observer's job is basically to, in an asynchronous fashion, have a look at all the list elements, and this is actually extremely useful. What it does is that it tells you with a series. It basically is an event dispatching system that knows where on the page, or rather, when the viewport is being scrolled, it can tell you when the element is actually at an intersection, and you can actually tweak when the certain aspects of this. We'll look at it in just a moment. So this options object here is basically just declaring for, this is a simple one, you can go and read the documentation, but in essence what the root margin is basically, alright, so I want to observe an element that is scrollable, and by default the root is going to be the page itself, the entire. You can actually put this observer on like some smaller div with a scroller inside if you wanted to, but I don't want to do that. I just want to have the whole thing, right? So the root margin is 0 pixels, which means that these events will actually start firing at the moment, or rather there will be no gap between the actual element and the time it starts scrolling. Because if, let's say, if I set this to 50 pixels, then the element itself, it doesn't make sense for the whole page. But if it's a smaller element and you get to a certain point where, all right, the browser now knows that you have the Y position of the element plus 50 pixels above it, then that margin is where this observer is actually going to start kicking in and start dispatching these events. It's a highly technical thing. Let's not dive into it too much. Threshold is just a property that allows you to say, all right, how much of the element that I'm observing has to be in the viewport for you to fire this event. And this number can be between 0 and 1, and that just means that if it's a 1, it means that that's 100%. It means that I want the entire element to be visible to my user before you fire off this code, right? Before this function fires. So here we are. We're going to get a bunch of entries and the observer object. We're not going to touch on that right now because this is what we want. So the entries is going to, I'll show you in just a moment, or rather we can do that immediately. Entries, let's do that. So it's going to fire to begin with all the entries, and the entries are simply objects that contain some information. So we have the bound incline rect if we want that, intersection ratio. These are not all that interesting right now, but this is the one that we're interested in, is intersecting. This property is the biggest, most beneficial thing that you can possibly have, and you get the target as well, which is just great. But this boolean here is the magic, because it is telling you if this element is in view. If I go down all the way down here, intersecting is false, because number 47, like the list element of number 47, is actually not in scope. It's not in, you can't actually know, it's outside of the viewport. But all the elements up until 15 or 16, they're going to have this boolean property set to true. That's what's so powerful about this. You don't have to do all the other stuff that you saw earlier. And so what we do is we go through all the entries and we filter out everything that is intersecting, because we only want things that are in the viewport. And then we do the same thing we saw earlier. We get the ID that we stored in a custom attribute and we check if it has been viewed, and then we simply filter out if it hasn't been viewed. That's it. We want to just have everything that hasn't been viewed. We don't have to do any other checking. We don't have to do unperformance stuff with isBound and client rect or anything like that. Finally, we map over and get all the IDs, and we do the same thing we saw earlier. If there are any IDs that haven't been seen, we simply send them to the server. This is a very, very powerful technique, because now you allow the browser to tell you in an asynchronous manner, without having to hook into any type of unperformance scroll events or anything like that, that hey, I want to actually see this thing, right? Or rather, I want to know when this element has entered the view. Now, this is a very trivial example that illustrates how you can actually see how you can use this, but what's even more powerful about this is that, let's say that you had a carousel or a lot of really heavy images on your page or anything like that. This will allow you to lazy load everything on your page. In theory, you could design your entire web page in a way so that you actually only add the element to the page if it's going to very soon, because that's the power of these margins. the margins and the threshold, you can actually, as I said, you can actually give it a little bit of space so it starts loading in the content just before it gets into the viewport. This is very similar to what iOS does with their list views when you program iOS applications. So I really urge you to do what I do and sit and basically cross your fingers that Safari and IE, or like everybody else, is going to catch up to this so we can use it very soon. Because this, I shit you not, this will change absolutely everything in terms of how you start thinking about progressive web applications and stuff of that nature, because this will literally allow you to, in a very easy manner, make every single web page you have become extremely performant. Because in theory, all you have to start or the way that you should think about it now is that, all right, instead of loading everything at the same time, I'll simply load the first thing that the user is going to see, and when the user starts scrolling and they are just about to hit some resource, some image or something like that, I can use the observer API, this intersection observer, to simply load that thing at that given time, and I can do so in an extremely performant manner without any type of magic or trickery or complexity to my code. I hope you found this useful. Have a great day.